Okay. This is Tony Zanetta. Good morning, Tony.
Right. Time. Yes. How
Yeah,
are you?
I'm doing fairly well. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Great. Um, Glad to hear it. Yeah, I've been, honored that you do this interview. And
I'm honored. You're proficient. You're prolific.
well, thank you. I do my best. It's just amazing. I was just got an email from Dana Gillespie, and we're going to be doing either a Zoom or a phoner because I'm doing this. As you probably know, I'm not shy about promoting myself. I'm working on a David Bowie tribute anthology, a literary tribute anthology, and I've already done a William S. Burroughs one and a Bauhaus one is in the works. So, and I've got Denise George is wrote me a piece about being a cage lady in in the Tin Machine video Under the Gods. So I really, you know,
Okay.
anyway.
So what? I don't understand. You're doing a David Bowie. David Bowie what?
I'm sorry. It's a David Bowie literary tribute anthology. So,
What is that? What does that consist of?
well, that consists of stories, poems, essays, articles, memoirs, things of that nature. And I did the same thing with William S. Burroughs. And
Oh.
so, um, but this interview, I'm doing this for my Substack. It's called Battery, and um, so at any rate, I'll just get into it. The first question, I've been kind of semi-obsessed with Warhol and Bowie for since I was you know late teens, early 20s, and and the song Andy Warhol specifically, I was always kind of fascinated by how that came about, and I know that Bowie wrote it for Dana Gillespie. But what was the sort of the circumstances around writing that song?
I don't have a clue.
Okay.
Well, I might have a little clue.
Right.
Um, well, first of all, let me just clear up one thing. We were not considered Warhol superstars.
Okay. Okay.
Because the play was a kind of a very separate thing from the factory and from the
Okay.
film.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
London, we did the play
Mm-hmm.
at La Mama in New York City,
Uh-huh.
and then we went to London. But the way the union rules were,
Mm-hmm.
we could bring like I don't know 7 or 8 people, and then the rest of the cast had to be cast out of English equity actors.
Okay.
So Tony Ingrazio, the director of the play, had an open audition, and Dana Gillespie came to that audition.
I see.
And the folklore was, I don't think it's true because she says it's not true.
Okay.
But we always thought that she took a script and then she gave it to David, and the song came from that. She denied that.
Oh, I see.
Not that long, but she said she never took a script.
Mm-hmm.
But there was that connection between Dana auditioning for the play, we were in London doing the play, and then I don't know the details, but David came up with that song
Mm-hmm.
during that summer.
Right.
So I would think the pork had something to do with it.
Okay.
That's just conjecture.
Okay. So pork. I mean, where did the title come from?
Well, pork, just a little background on pork.
Sure.
In the late 60s, the portable tape recorder with a phone attachment became very trendy. Everybody had them, and everybody was taping each other's phone conversations,
Right.
particularly around the factory, and particularly Andy Warhol, and particularly Bridget Berlin.
Right.
So Bridget Berlin was a Warhol star, Andy's possibly best friend, but because her father, Richard Berlin, was the top executive of the Hearst Corporation, and she grew up really as a socialite, she didn't go by Bridget Berlin. She basically went by Bridget Polk. And the name Bridget Polk came because she was an amphetamine addict, and she would go around with a needle, and she would literally poke people with with amphetamine.
Oh my gosh.
So she was called Bridget Polk.
Right. In the ass, or that was what I heard. In the ass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They'd be walking by, and suddenly the needle would go.
Oh my gosh.
That was Bridget. She was a pretty outrageous woman. And then I just lost my train of thought. Oh, okay. So she was also heavy. So pork was sort of, a joke on her weight and a joke on Coke.
Right.
Because all the names were changed. The tapes, and this is where I think the most controversial thing about pork was not controversial in terms of an aesthetic way, but in terms of like why pork possibly has never been done again. Because the tapes were for the most part, Bridget. She would do these tapes and she would sell the tapes to Andy for $25.
Oh wow.
So the tapes that made up pork, no one could prove who did the tape, he or she. Most of pork is recorded phone conversations between the two of them. But there are some conversations that he's not on. It's her speaking to someone else. So obviously, he didn't do that.
Right.
Plus, the year before, she had done a live, I'll call it a performance, at the Bowery Lane Theater in New York. It was called Bridget Polk Strikes. Look it up. It's interesting.
Sure.
And she stood on stage talking, but one of the things she did standing on stage is she called people on the phone, and that was the performance. You could hear them talking on the phone. And the famous part of the evening is she called this guy, told him she needed an abortion, and could he lend her the money? And she literally left the theater, went up to his apartment, got the money, and came back and finished the performance.
So badass.
Yeah, that's the kind of gal Bridget.
Nice.
Did you ever see the documentary on her?
No.
Well, you'd like it, I think. It's called Pie in the Sky.
I will watch that, definitely.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
She was such an unusual combination of, qualities. She was a total individual, and she was, even though she's poking people in the ass with her hypodermic, she's a very well-bred young lady.
Yeah.
Her mother was a Park Avenue socialite, Honey Berlin. So she's a very interesting combo of things.
Right.
But that's really what pork was. All these. It really wasn't a play; it was a performance.
Right.
In a way, it really was performance art because it was staged versions of the telephone conversation.
Yes.
And so my point was that it was controversial as to whose tapes they actually were in terms of copyright. And then the other element thrown into it was Tony Ingrassia, the director, took liberties with a lot of it, and he edited it and put it into an order. And he had a credit as, I don't know, Coke or something. So it was never really clear who owned the copyright to that.
That's really, really interesting, and it kind of gets into a related thing I kind of wanted to ask you about. Like, was there a relationship between, say, the Dada cut-up method of Tristan Tzara and certainly Marcel Duchamp, did innovated conceptual art, and Andy Warhol. I mean, was he influenced in any
Well,
way
it wasn't just
by that?
Andy Warhol.
Hmm.
We were all part of the Playhouse of the Ridiculous,
Yeah.
or that's called the Playhouse, the
Hmm.
Theater of the Ridiculous.
Right.
Playhouse of the Ridiculous was specifically John Vaccaro and Ronnie Tavel.
I see.
But part of the ridiculous was number one proponent, one of the most well known, was Jackie Curtis.
Right.
Who was a part of the ridiculous and also a part of Warhol's factory,
Hmm.
and a playwright.
Yes.
But Jackie's playwriting was totally cut and paste.
Okay.
Whether she was aware of the Dada method or not, I don't know. Maybe she was.
Hmm.
But that's what a lot of, and she wasn't the only one doing this. Wayne County then wrote a play called World Birth for Nation, but their writing was really collages.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Now Jackie was capable of also, she did write some plays, but most of her best known work was these collages, and they would be song titles and lines from movies, and maybe a whole scene lifted from something, and then kind of thrown together into this an order, quote unquote, an order.
Yeah.
When I met these people, I met them I was in a play called World Birth of a Nation.
Right.
And that was written, quote unquote, by Wayne County. And that was totally what Wayne County was obsessed with British pop and the Bible. So when you cut those interests together, it was pretty fascinating, actually. Now, David always said that's how he wrote his songs, also that it was on cut and paste. Did he? I don't know. I mean, I wasn't sitting next to him while he was writing a song.
Right.
But I think he did use that technique to a certain degree, yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's that video where, I don't know, I would call it an infamous video, where he's sitting at a table and he's got these open lines of cocaine and like a carton of milk, and he's busily cutting and pasting his lyrics onto a piece of paper or something like that, and it's a fascinating.
That was probably during the Diamond Dogs.
Yeah.
And what he was doing is he was working on a film version of Diamond Dogs.
Oh, I see.
And he was doing lots of drawings, and yes, he was doing lots of cutting and pasting these different things together. And in Diamond Dogs, three of the characters were Jackie Curtis, and I forget if it was Wayne County and Holly Woodlawn, but it was like basically the Warhol drag queens.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, I'd read that it was at first it was supposed to be just like based on. I mean, the album was supposed to be based on 1984, and he couldn't get the rights. Is that?
That is correct, actually. Yeah. The idea, and it's interesting, some of the connections, what connected and what didn't connect, because I've always been fascinated by the connections between the Ridiculous in New York and Lindsay Kemp's company in England.
Right.
And there were a lot of similarities, even though they weren't like conscious. I mean, I don't think the Ridiculous was consciously aware of Lindsay as vice versa. But they were a lot of the same influences, like kabuki for one thing, and like the whole idea of not being a traditional form, but mixing all these different things together, like circus and drag and dance and mime. They both shared all those things, and David was, of course, a part of Lindsay's company.
Yeah.
So 1984. And this is at a time so this is after the retirement of Ziggy, and he started working on this idea, based on 1984, and we were still involved with this director of Pork in Gracia, who was also a good friend of idea of 1984 and this treatment of 1984.
Okay.
And two things happened. No, we couldn't get the rights. The widow would not grant the rights. And number two, Bowie and Ingrassia were like oil and water. There was no way that they were going to work together and come up with anything. Because they were both, it was a fight for power, whatever it was. I don't know.
Yeah.
So that didn't happen. But Bowie being the resource, Bowie was always very resourceful, and so took whatever he was using on his 1984 ideas and turned that into Diamond Dogs,
Yeah.
which was probably a lot more interesting than 1984 would have been.
Right.
But I find that true of a lot of art, where a lot of great art is actually a failure at something else. But it becomes more interesting, as its own thing.
And I mean, this is out of context and not apropos, but I always loved John Waters' quote about, like, the whole purpose of art is to ruin things. Right?
I like that.
Yeah. And it just felt like with the factory, one of the things that I've always fascinated me about Warhol is the concept of taking something that is very high prestige and distinguished, like art, and in many ways, like Marcel Duchamp, putting popular culture and advertising, viewing it through the lens of art, and then like flattening the distinctions between high art and low art, or between drag queens and Elizabeth Taylor.
Right.
So you could be
right.
You could be Elizabeth Taylor. You didn't have to.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And that wasn't really a question, but what was it? What was it like, sort of on the, in the, I mean, in the factory scene has been is legendary, and there's all sorts of different versions, and so many films and books have come out over the years, particularly like Factory Girl. I've heard that's very inaccurate. What did you think of the film Factory Girl?
I didn't see it. I don't like to see stuff like that.
Okay. What do you mean by stuff like that?
I don't like seeing things that I was involved or semi-involved in.
Okay.
I always find them like, oh my god, like Velvet Goldmine. Oh my god, what a travesty.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What Velvet Goldmine did though was they took certain visuals and they duplicated them. Those are really good. But the rest of it's like pure fantasy. It has nothing to do with any kind of reality.
Yeah.
So any kind of like attempt at that kind of biographical stuff is just, I think, total bullshit.
Right. Yeah.
And my experience with the factory, first of all, it was later. My experience was in 1971, 72.
Okay.
The factory, when people talk about the factory, they're really talking about the 60s. And they're really talking about the Silver Factory.
Oh, okay.
Which was on the east side of Manhattan, West 47th Street. That's where the whole idea of the factory came to fame, and that's where Edie Sedgwick was, and Undine, and Taylor Mead, and blah blah blah. And that's probably where the film portraits were done, and a lot of the famous early work was done there. Then the factory moved from there to Union Square, 17th Street, and that's where the factory that I went to.
Okay.
That factory, and I was there probably in a period of transition, because the factory became, instead of this like I don't know, epic center of wild downtown underground New York, and then it became a very business-like operation. I mean, the factory was set up, the Union Square factory was there to make money.
Right.
And the whole, and also it has to do with like before Andy was shot and after Andy was shot.
Right.
Because everything changed a lot after he was shot. And the whole personnel changed after he was shot. And that's when it became like a lot more buttoned up and more business-like. Instead of like Wild Queens from the Lower East Side, it was more like Red Hughes, and Paul Morrissey was still there. But and Bridget was always the reception. She always answered the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
like
Right.
Pat Hackett, Bob Colacello, they were like more middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And Andy was then doing the portraits that he was selling, I think, for $25,000 each.
Right.
So they were courting rich socialites to buy these pictures.
Yes. I mean,
Okay.
did he need
Go
the
ahead.
money, or was that?
Well, who doesn't need money?
I know. I mean, it's a dumb question, but you know.
No, but of course, at root, he was a graphic artist. He was. I mean, what he did was really kind of brilliant. That he took graphic art and turned it into fine art.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he wanted to be a fine artist, so he just stuck the Sam Campbell's soup can on the wall, and that was fine art. And he did he did the same with the book what's it which is that's the first tape recorded work that was recordings of Ondine, and it was just word for word. And Ondine was a speed freak, so it was just Ondine speed talking for like a couple of hours. That became a book, and then Pork was the same thing too.
What was the name of the Ondine's book? Right. I mean, it was like Ondine transcription, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I read that one actually. Was that when did he come up with the philosophy of Andy Warhol?
That was more like 72, 73, I think.
Okay. So Valerie Solana shot Andy Warhol in 1968, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And that marked the transition between the two factories, right?
Yeah, well, he became more guarded after that. Yes.
Right.
And there weren't as many. Andy was not a druggie. I mean, maybe he did Overtrol, which is like a diet pill, but he wasn't a speed. He wasn't shooting up speed or things like that. But he was surrounded by people who were in the 50s. After the shooting, he wasn't anymore. That cleaned it. Those people were gone.
Yeah. Did you have much interaction with, let's say, Nico or?
No, I didn't have any interaction with her.
Okay.
None.
But
Jerry Miller, because Jerry Miller was in the play.
Right.
I knew Geraldine Smith a little bit. Maybe what's her name? Andrea Warhola Whips a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Who else do I know? I knew Jackie and Candy very well.
Yeah.
And Holly, I knew. Candy actually grew up on Long Island with Tony and Gracia.
Okay.
They both came to Massapequa Park, and they went to high school together. And I met Candy in 1966.
Oh wow!
With Tony and Gracia.
That's when I was born.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's when I moved to New York.
Yeah, I was born on Halloween Day in 1966. Yeah.
Oh wow. Interesting.
Yeah. I didn't. But you knew Lou Reed, right? I mean, you introduced.
I only met Lou Reed a handful of times.
Oh, okay.
It's funny because I just connected to his first wife, Betty Gronstadt, Elizabeth Gronstadt. She's on Facebook.
Right. Yeah.
She wrote, and I had met Betty back, I don't know, 71, I guess. Mm-hmm. And she was always like, you would look at, our impression of Betty was that she was sort of vapid and a pretty blonde, and was like, what a weird couple, what's he doing with her? As it turns out, of course, she's an English professor, she teaches literature, and she's written a book called The Perfect Day about her relationship with Lou.
Oh, wow.
It's hard to get through because it's a little depressing because it's basically the story of a drug addict. Yeah.
Right. Yes, as are many of these tales, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, and it's just a side note. We were talking about how the tales, excuse me, the stories become distorted, and particularly in transition to other media. And like I have a good friend named Carrie Lee Chrome. She was the founder of the Runaways, and a very, very similar thing happened to her. Um, and so her whole experience with Kim Fowley was very traumatizing, and the Runaways movie is complete garbage.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very uh, it's very. I hear on that. Um, the Ziggy Stardust character. So it was kind of
Yeah.
a little bit of kabuki. It's a little bit of um, it's from what is your interpretation of the character? Is he from outer space? What is he? What's Ziggy? Yeah,
I don't know how valuable that is.
for what it's worth. Okay.
For what it's worth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think he was an alien. And I mean, he was David's fantasy of a pop star from another galaxy or another planet. I mean, I think it was accidentally the most clever thing that David could have done because he had been working for a long time. He wasn't the most exciting performer.
Really?
No, he's like a folk singer until he came up with Ziggy Stardust. And Ziggy Stardust was a character that he could play and that totally freed him on stage to be this rock star that he wanted to be. He couldn't be that on his own, not until he created the character. So whether he was from outer space or not, I mean, it's kind of irrelevant. He was able to become that character and create an exciting piece of rock and roll theater.
Yeah, yeah. So there was he played around with these different kind of personas that he would pour himself into. One of them was the gnome. What was it? The laughing gnome, right?
Well, that came way before.
Right.
Was that a character? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I believe that the laughing gnome was part of the DNA of what ultimately became Ziggy Stardust. I mean, I think from just watching some documentaries, which could be full of crap. But then he had the Arnold Corns character, which is much closer to Ziggy, right?
Well, that was Freddie, right? Am I mixing up?
I'm not sure. I thought it was Arnold Corns, and then that kind of morphed into Ziggy.
Yeah, but Arnold Corns, I can't remember what he recorded at Arnold Corns.
Okay.
But his friend Freddie Barrett, who became his costume designer, he thought Freddie was very good looking, so he thought Freddie should be a pop star. So Arnold Corns was actually Freddie.
Oh, okay.
But with David singing.
I see. And
yes, he was a rehearsal of Ziggy. Absolutely. He was like a template.
Right. And then there was that guy, I forget his name, but help me out. He was this very sort of notorious. Well, I mean, certainly Anthony Newley was really inspirational. I know that, but he was this rock and roll guy, and he was sort of like a British Cliff Richards or something, or Elvis, but he was really,
I
really
don't know.
strange.
Oh, I do know. I'm blanking. I know who you mean. I can't think of his name.
Right. So
I mean, the thing about David that I think it fascinates me to this day is that he is very smart, and he was very I don't want to say intellectual, but I'll say what's the word? He studied things. He would call himself a producer. He was a producer because he was very into ideas. He wasn't. I don't think David was the most talented. He certainly wasn't the most talented musician, and I don't think he was the most talented songwriter or singer. But he was really smart.
Right.
And he really wanted this. He was very focused and very ambitious. And he studied for years. I mean, he started recording when he was like 15 or 16. So it took 10 years. And he was a fast learner.
Yeah.
So everything along the way, Lindsay Kemp, Ken Pitt. Ken Pitt was extremely influential with David because Ken Pitt but Ken Pitt was like an old fashioned showbiz guy and gay.
Right.
And but David absorbed what Ken Pitt was able to teach him, he could absorb. But again, he didn't use it in the way that Ken Pitt intended him to use.
Right. Well, you don't, right?
But he used it nevertheless.
Yeah, I think what's great about that is it gives us all hope. I mean, it took me 40 years to make it, So, like, seeing how he tried things on and learned from everybody and was a quick study, that's very inspirational. I'm surprised that you say that he wasn't very. I mean, I don't want to. What was the exact word that you used?
My opinion, but go ahead.
That he didn't seem very charismatic or interesting or talented. I mean.
Oh, he wasn't. He wasn't.
Okay.
No, that's not just my opinion. That's a lot of people's opinion.
Okay.
Until he discovered Ziggy.
Okay, that's the caveat, right? Until he discovered.
And I'll go a step further.
Okay.
And until he discovered Zach Ronson.
Right. Okay, so what was until he discovered what was the first factor?
The thing about Ziggy.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't very interesting until he discovered X. What was that?
Well, I said until he created this character.
Until he created Ziggy Stardust.
That he could then play.
Yeah.
Again, Arnold Coins was a little bit of a rehearsal for that. That process took a while. Because they did that show at the Roundhouse with Tony Visconti. They all wore costumes. But that was like too corny, I'm sure. But it's still a good step in the right direction.
Right.
Also, you cannot underestimate Mary Angela Barnett.
Okay.
This process or this period. She was a very interesting woman. I mean, a young girl at that point, but she was very exuberant and very smart. And she was 150, maybe more percent supportive of everything that he did. And she had outlandish ideas of her own.
Okay.
So she was like a courage making machine.
Interesting.
She was like constantly behind him, yakking, and taking care of what she could take care of.
Yeah.
So David was very good at it. What Lindsay Kemp said once was that David was the kind of person who always opens the door for. And I think that's very telling because he was the kind of person who always opens the door for. And everybody around him kind of opened different doors for him.
Yeah.
He was able to surround himself with a group of extremely supportive people.
Right.
He's also, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he was boring or dull. He was very charming and charismatic in a way, but he wasn't the most exciting performer for sure.
Okay, so in proportion or in relationship to other people, like other performers, I mean.
Yeah, but he was always charming.
Right.
He was very, very seductive.
Right.
And that was one of the ways he gleaned information by seducing people.
Interesting.
He had a way of drawing people very close to him, people that he was attracted to for whatever reason. And then he would kind of glean the information and then he would move on.
Now, while you were describing him, I made copious notes from one of your interviews, but I kept thinking, a lot of this is very reminiscent. It reminds me of Andy Warhol, or at least how he's been portrayed, and particularly like Drella, right?
I think there were similarities for sure.
Yeah.
What were the similarities? So yeah, definitely with those blank wall here. Um, but I don't know if that was so much David as us. Main Man was very much like our version of the factory, for sure. You know, that we were surrounding the central figure, which was David. Although it wasn't really David, it was really Tony DeFries. But
Right.
still, that's neither here nor there.
Right, right.
But it was still a similar thing in that we created this circus
Mm-hmm.
that I don't think did him any harm for at least a while.
Wow, that's a yeah, yeah. So I mean, there were shenanigans. I mean, I just what was how crazy did it get?
Well, what? It wasn't Diddy. I don't.
Well, I mean, we're talking, you guys invented sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Well, I don't know if we invented it.
You know what I mean? For our era.
Well, when I went to 1971 to do pork, one of the first things I noticed and kind of surprised me was that the English, they were very reserved in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And we were much louder and more boisterous, especially when it came to sex. However, they were a lot more sophisticated than we were. That bisexuality was very common. No one batted an eye,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't really mean anything. Whereas the Americans were like so into labeling things,
Right.
and all that. And basically, Americans were so much more hung up about sex than English were. And I think David was sexually precocious from early teens, but it wasn't really a big deal.
Right.
But we Americans who came over to do pork, I mean, we were so loud and so. But I think my point is, if I can get to it, is that going back to again to what's his name, Ken Pitt.
Mm-hmm.
Ken Pitt was an older, like gay. He was old school gay, and he was very much like trying to get David to appeal to a gay world, a gay community, like become the Judy Garland of the '70s or something like that.
Okay.
And when we
but there was already a Judy Garland present at least in the '70s,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So,
but pork, and I think I think David picked up on this, but I don't know. We never talked about it. Pork represented a kind of sexual outlaw kind of thing. Yeah, it was very openly sexual, and it was very much more defiant. And so I think it was, and I think that appealed to David because it was very modern. That it wasn't like going back to Judy Garland or back to the gay '50s. It was something new, and it was more outrageous. It was flamboyant. It was defiant. It was in your face. So I think that's what attracted him to us in pork. That's just my theory, and I think he absorbed that also.
Right.
Not that he wasn't that, but he was in it. But he was much more quiet, reserved, that English way.
Yes. So I just have some random quotes that I jotted down in no particular order, and one of them was Cherry popped a tit, and I don't know the context.
Okay, well, what that is, Cherry played the part of Pork, Bridget Polk. Bridget Polk, not only did she go around poking people in the ass with a needle, she popped a tit. That was one of her signatures.
Oh, nice.
So as the character,
just the one, or
yeah, usually just one.
Okay.
So as the character playing that role in play, Cherry popped a tit. So that was a signature movement of Pork. So that when they went to the country club to see David, she popped a tit. When he announced them.
And that was controversial, I guess. There was.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if anybody even knew at the concert. I don't think particularly. I don't know. I wasn't there.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean, the play had certain sexual things that were if you take out this, take out that, take out the other thing, what you really have is you're a good man, Charlie Brown.
Uh,
There was like a kind of a childishness, like a childlike quality about the play. It was actually kind of sweet, but there were like these outrageous things put in, like Jerry Miller douched on stage, but it wasn't like prurient. I mean, it wasn't sexual, like to get you aroused. Like same thing with taking a tit out. It was just kind of cute.
that sounds completely wholesome and just like your good man Charlie Brown. I mean, except for the the douching and the titty popping. But
Well, the douching even was a little wholesome.
I'm sure.
To the audience, she had a beautiful douchebag,
Oh wow.
bejeweled. Anyway,
Wow. Wow. That's kind of fascinating. So you played Andy Warhol. Is that correct?
I certainly did. Yeah.
So how did you I mean, was there preparation? Did you observe Andy closely, or did you just how did you
I did
inhabit
observe
that role?
Now I did observe it because he would come to rehearsals,
Hmm.
and well, I'll tell you what my take on it. What happened to her was this another thing. Diet pill called Ovitrol,
Yes.
and that was a very common drug at that time. A lot of creative people took it. Or a lot of people took it. Period.
Yeah.
And I occasionally took a diet pill called Escatrol.
Okay.
And when I would look at Andy, what I would relate to was it seemed like he was on Escatrol. I didn't know he was on Ovitrol, but it reminded me of how I was on Escatrol. And what Escatrol did is it made you very speedy, except physically it made you very quiet, kind of calm, you know. So that was part of what I used to create the character. But I just watched him and picked up some of his mannerisms and pretending I was on Escatrol.
Interesting. Now, it was one of the things. I mean, I just that I admire about Andy was that he felt. I mean, I correct me if I'm wrong, but he felt very insecure about his physical appearance, right, and his skin condition.
Yeah, and I never totally understood because he wasn't that bad looking. He
Right.
was actually quite good looking.
Right. I mean, he was a handsome guy, right? So he kind of created he created Andy Warhol, the character, and he sort of like was purposefully vacant, or was he like that?
My experience was he was like that, but again, I was not on intimate terms with him.
Okay. Right.
But that's the interesting thing. Another similarity between him and David Bowie. He created a character.
Right.
And
And I was going to ask you, have you seen the film Basquiat?
no.
Okay. You don't watch those movies that you had something to do with, right? Okay. Because I would be really really curious your take on comparing your Warhol impersonation with Bowie.
Right, with David.
Yeah.
Well, that's that's a little. I didn't want to look too closely at that, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
Since when I met him, I was doing that, and then suddenly a few years later, he does it for that movie. But whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, and I don't know if this has anything to do with David, but in New York, in the '60s particularly, like Andy, John Vaccaro, who created the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. There was another Jack Smith, who was sort of considered the father of performance art. There were a lot of these guys who, number one, they were all Midwestern. Number two, they tended to be children of immigrants, and they were very sensitive, artistic boys who were gay. And they, in a way, created a whole new way of being gay because they were very defiant.
Right.
They wouldn't accept the limitations put on them. And
right.
Andy, for instance, was totally. I mean, he's a graphic artist, which the art world would totally look
Jackson Pollock.
Who would not accept somebody like Louis Warhol.
Right.
But he very cleverly created the character and created a career as a fine artist.
Yeah. I mean,
David Bowie, I'm not sure.
Right. I mean, I love watching the interview that Merv Griffin did with him and Edie Sedgwick, where 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 Warhol was actually either pretending to be shy or actually shy to the point where Edie had to speak for him.
Right.
Was that
kind of shy? Yeah.
But I mean, was that kind of an act, or did they set that up, or was that a real thing?
I think a little bit of both.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it became self-perpetuating.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was shy. Again, playing on stage, it was like a dream role for an actor because that character was the center of the play, but he didn't have to say much.
Yeah.
And I think that was like kind of the position that Warhol was in the world he created. That kind of thing. Everything revolved around him.
Yeah.
But he let the other, it was like a circus around him. He was like very still in the center of it all.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just the first things that comes to mind is have you heard the album Songs for Drella?
No.
Okay. I was kind of curious what you would make of that. This John Cale and Lou Reed.
Right.
Yeah. So there were some other people who were part of the port that, like Harvey Fierstein, who's certainly went on to, major stardom. Did you know him very well, or?
Yeah, he actually lives not that far from me.
Oh, okay.
Connecticut.
Wow.
I've seen him a couple of times. I mean, I knew him fairly well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get a hold of him, because I think he's wonderful, but that's neither here nor there. So let's see.
Well, he was like 17 years old. That was the first thing he ever did.
Right. I mean,
and that was again a case where he came into the open call, the audition, and he was heavy set, and he had that deep, gravelly voice. And then Grosser just took one look at him and said, "Oh, you're in the play."
Nice. Now, this is very, very interesting sort of question that so I don't know you at all, but you've been like at ground zero with some of the most legendary cultural figures of our time, and are you a sort of like, would you describe yourself as an outgoing, charismatic person, or are you introverted, or what are you? I mean, how would you define yourself?
Both.
Right? Okay, that's not fair.
I mean, yeah. I can be very outgoing, and I can be also introverted and shy. No, I find it. I'm kind of amused by the fact that I've been associated with these people groups. Like, I don't know why, but yes, that's been my life. It's been interesting.
Yeah. If you were to somehow, this is an impossible question, I realize, but if you were to extract Tony Zanetta from your sort of being embedded with, so to speak, with Warhol and with Bowie, what would you be? Would you be anything?
Well, I've spent the last 30 years until COVID working in the textile industry, designing and installing showrooms.
Interesting. Do you like that?
I got into that by being in theater. Because I ended up kind of like designing sets and creating installations in nightclubs and theater.
Wow.
But I needed to make a living, and I somehow stumbled upon that world. And it was very similar, except that it was in a very commercial form, and it was like, much
Right,
so it was the same. It was the same process. It was a creative process.
right.
It was very interesting to me because I could use my theatrical
Sure.
sensibilities to create these kind of fun spaces.
I
And
love that.
I did that for a long time.
I love that. What are some of the challenges of designing like showrooms with textiles?
The challenges,
Yeah,
well,
I mean creative challenges or logistic challenges maybe.
yeah. Well, I got into this kind of gradually, and I worked for two really good designers.
Hmm.
But I learned one of the things I learned from them was that a showroom is not really. It involves interior design, but it's not interior design.
Hmm.
And this is where I think my theater background was valuable
Yeah.
because I approached it more like theater in that I knew that the purpose of the showroom was to grab people's attention,
Yes.
not that it had to be a perfectly designed
Right.
interior space. Whereas it was not about the teacups or about, the little accessories here and there. You just had to kind of make a broad statement.
Hmm.
And I thought, coming from where I came from, it should be fun. So I tried to infuse a sense of fun. I ended up getting into producing events for them.
Nice.
They would have a big press party, and I liked the press parties, and I knew that I could make the press parties more fun than what they were doing.
Right. Now,
So I did that too, and that was like real totally theatrical. I would sometimes use models or actors.
nice.
Yeah.
Now, how did the little teacups come into play here?
Well, I was the one designer that was very detailed.
Okay.
Because you would get lost in the accessories
Hmm.
and trying to make a beautiful room. Well, you just really have to make a beautiful room. That could take what you were really doing was in this case you were showing a bed. So we would be creating bedrooms.
Interesting.
But you didn't have to like have it so that it was out of the world of interiors necessarily.
Hmm.
It could be done in a simpler. You would expound too much energy on small details that doesn't really mean anything. That's
Right.
right.
Right. And it would be meaningless, right? People
Yeah,
come
at
in,
the end of
they're
the day, it was kind of meaningless. I mean, it was kind of cute, but it didn't really propel anything further.
that would, that just gave me an idea. Like, what if you'd taken the showroom thing and produced it like a play,
Oh yeah, I love that idea.
right?
And I wanted to do that. I wanted to do another version of Pork, but it never went anywhere.
Hmm.
Yeah, originally Andy wanted to do Pork in different rooms
Hmm.
and have the audience go from one room to another.
Right.
I love that idea. That's fabulous.
Yeah. There's been several things that have been done that way. I mean, I think there was a play about Tamara de Lampica that was like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Oh. Well, there's also these things, these environmental things in New York. The McKintrick Hotel, I think,
Uh-huh.
where they're like an empty building, and these theater companies take it over, and you kind of walk through the space, and there's things happening all around you.
Hmm.
And to tell you the truth, I've never been to one, so I don't know. But it's also the same idea as far as I understand.
Yeah. The in terms of designing a space, now the like the the Diamond Dogs tour is
Right.
still influential to this day. Excuse me. And it's been cited as influencing, every like Taylor Swift and what was the innovation that you created or you had something to do with as far as the set design for the Diamond Dogs? And how
Well,
did
I
parents
did not influence the set design, but what I did influence was sort of something more conceptual, where after the retirement, quote unquote, um, we felt we had to come up, we had to come up with something conceptually and marketing wise
Mhm.
that would sort of enable basically what it was a retirement stardust.
Mhm.
But none of this was clear at the always wanted things, and David having this reputation as being very theatrical, I didn't quite understand where that reputation was coming from. Now I see it more clearly. But so I thought he should be doing something. When he came back, he should be doing something much more theatrical.
I see.
And my idea, I thought Diamond Dogs was actually much too literate. Or yeah, that basically my idea of theatrical was creating a setting with different level. You know, David was very good at using the entire stage. He would jump up on the apps, or he would, you know, he just used the stage very well.
Yes.
Of course, he had all those costumes. But so I thought that the idea was to give him more variety on a stage, so that he would have, you know, create different moments around the stage. Then we got Jules Fisher involved. And that was through a woman that I hired from our office, who was kind of Broadway-ish. I mean, looking back, I think Diamond Dogs was fantastic, but at the time I kind of thought in some ways and David tired of it soon, because it was too burdensome. It was very difficult to move. There were a lot of moving parts that could go wrong. It was like too much. So quite that theatrical.
Right.
You know, later that same year, the Rolling Stones did influenced by David, Diamond Dogs, I'm sure, did a tour, and the stage was in the shape of a star, and the points of the star kind of like bounced and moved up and down.
Nice.
I mean, it did exactly what I had wanted for David, was it gave Mick Jagger all sorts of places to run to on that stage that were interesting to look at.
Neat.
Yeah. But having said that, that was spectacular. I mean, some of the crane and the diamond that he came out on, and it was opened up, and it was a little staircase, and the bridge, it was all pretty fantastic.
Now, I think one of the interviews that I watched with you, you said that for some reason there isn't a whole lot of recordings of this, or not at all, or.
No, only the documentary that Alan Yantok did, Cracked Actor. But it was videotaped. I mean, practically every performance is videotaped. I don't have those videotapes. They have never surfaced.
Okay. Now, the retirement of the Ziggy Stardust character, from my understanding, was not designed. It was almost spontaneous. Is that right, or?
Well, I'm sure he did decide on the spur of the moment.
Right.
I mean, it had to do with two things mainly. Number one, it had to do with the publishing issue, where DeVries was taking it from one publishing. They were getting rid of a publishing company anyway, but DeVries didn't want him to write any new material for a while.
Okay.
The other thing it had to do with the Spiders, the band. And if you look at David's history, it's no surprise that he would get rid of the band, because he got rid of every band that he had ever worked with.
Right.
So this seemed, and the Spiders never were really a band. They were backup musicians that seemed to be a band. And they had been, well, they wanted to be paid.
Right.
They were being paid almost nothing. So they caused a little bit of a flurry, and both DeVries and Bowie did not appreciate that at all. They decided to get rid of them. So that was the second part of it. And then I think also what happened, well, that you know, that he, so the last show we'll ever do was the last show he was going to do with them. He didn't exactly retire the character. Then we did the Midnight Special, the TV thing, a few months later, and that was like Ziggy on steroids.
Oh, wow.
But the other thing that happened then, that nobody really looks at, is that David has been, you know, working towards this goal for many years. on one second. I'll be right back.
Sure. Yes.
Hello.
Yes. Hi.
Oh, you're there.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and so he had been working really since he was a teenager, but they had also been doing, like, he and Tony DeFries had been together for like about 3 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And Angie, so the whole, like,
Right.
and the whole, like, rebranding and working toward, I mean, and you know, they were shameless. They were looking for world domination, and DeFries was there, the biggest star of the 20th century, and blah, 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 blah. Way before that, that was merited. Reese was very ambitious. David was very ambitious.
Sure.
And they did this whole thing basically on a shoestring because it was all smoke and mirrors.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked. We toured for like a year solid, and then at the end of this, July of 1970, was it 2 or 3? No, three.
Mm-hmm.
He's responsible for 4% of all record sales in the United Kingdom. I mean, so he had not stopped working for a year. Suddenly, he stopped and could take a breath. And when he stopped and took a breath, the pop star that he had dreamed of being since he was like 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And DeFries is the mogul that he had dreamed of being for the last
Wow.
few. Yeah, they took a moment and they savored their success. And in some ways, they were a little bit spoiled by their success.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what the point was I was trying to make.
Okay, I'll just.
So that was part of the retirement also.
Yeah.
Had a moment to take stock and take a breath.
Right.
Before moving on.
So, very briefly, you were the head of Main Man Entertainment. What did that consist of?
Good question. I never did figure that out.
Oh, okay.
It was, it was really a figurehead because Main Man was Tony DeFries, period. Mm-hmm. But I was the face of it in some ways, and I was a much more practical person than DeFries. Mm-hmm. So, like a lot of especially in the beginning, I mean, I did all the hiring, I brought in all the other people, and I was kind of always the voice of reason. This is me talking, but it's true. I was more the voice of reason because they were always way up in the sky. Uh-huh. And I was more practical.
Right.
So in some ways, I was a facilitator of things and ideas also.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Sure.
Okay.
I kind of want to go back to that transition period where David was still kind of trying to find his pop star vehicle, and this was, and you said that I'm sorry, Pitt was one of the names, and Lindsay Kent.
Ken Pitt.
Ken Pitt, right.
Do you know anything about Ken Pitt?
No, to be honest, no, I don't.
Well, he was David's manager for probably 4 or 5 years before Tony DeFries.
Okay.
But he was an old school, he was actually the publicist in London. He was older. David actually lived with him on and off.
Okay.
And he was a gay man. He was an older gay man. Mm-hmm. David also had that, wasn't shy about, like I said, using people.
Right, okay.
I'm not saying anything. I don't know what went on between them, but that would not have been an issue with David at all. Mm-hmm. It was very, whatever, I don't know.
Okay, and Angie Bowie, what's she like? Oh boy.
Well, she's truly one of a kind, and she was
Mm-hmm.
She was that way, but she was also crop up with the people that are wrong. I mean, she was an interesting combination of things. Very, very bright,
Mm-hmm.
and um, just so totally behind him. You know, and she was kind of the emissary in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
She was very outgoing, or could be very outgoing.
Right.
Where he um, could be very reticent, and he could be very introverted. So she was the one that kind of went out to the outside world and brought things in. She went shopping. She brought fabrics in. She brought people in. You know, all sorts of things, ideas she would bring in. But then, of course, they were filtered through him.
Yeah.
I don't think she could have done anything on her own, but she was wonderful in terms of being the support and being this person that was constantly stimulating him to do his thing.
Yeah.
But she was also very, I mean, and they seemed in the beginning like they were perfectly in sync.
Yeah.
And, you know, you didn't know who was going to start the conversation and who was going to end it. They were like very, very, very much in sync. But then as you got to know them and as time went on, you realized that they were in sync in a way, but whatever marriage they had or whatever relationship